Hi, I'm Marty, and thanks to everyone who's subscribed to the channel, and thank you to everyone who have made helpful comments and suggestion and added interesting facts to the videos we've made so far. It's really appreciated, and I love how much interest people still have in Sydney's tramways, and that's why we're making these videos. Now, to date, we've stayed north of the harbour, and after a few questions about if we'll ever do other lines like the Western lines, I thought, well, why not? So in this video, we'll look at the inner western lines of the Sydney system, and they were served by trams for more than 75 years between 1882 and 1958. So welcome to the story of the western lines of the Sydney tram system, and welcome to BackTracks. The inner west lines were a significant part of the Sydney system, but they were also probably the most complex, because not only did they run in non-direct routes, due to the harbours and its bays, but they also crisscrossed each other and they changed service patterns over the years. And they were also interconnected with lines from the other depots. The western lines were also known as the red lines after the colour of the original destination symbols, and also the George Street lines because they ran down George Street after leaving either Circular Quay, Millers Point and Fort Macquarie. And once they reached the end of George Street at Railway Square, they then fanned out north or west to the various destinations. In peak hours and other busy periods, some services also operated from Railway Square. Now, the 1920s were seen as the boom period for the Western lines, with up to 200 trams in use at any one time on these lines. The network opened with the Glebe Point line and the first section of the Balmain line as far as Forest Lodge. But it was a pretty humble start with just a single line operated by a steam tram in 1882. But then over the next couple of decades, the line then expanded the furthest and the longest of any of the lines in the network, heading north, west to Abbotsford and south to Hurlston Park and Canterbury. So let's take a look at the western lines of the Sydney system one by one. There was a variety of different operating patterns and changes over the decades, so we'll just focus at the lines of how they basically existed in the early 1950s. During the life of the system, most of the services started at Circular Quay. Now, the western lines are on the left-hand side of this picture, and 61 years later, trams again ran from this location down George Street. I'm going to say that the original lines for the western lines are perhaps under where the Railway Carl Expressway is today. They then travelled down George Street to Railway Square at the south end of the Central Business District. Here the western lines are on the right-hand side of the picture as we are looking south. Railway Square has changed significantly in the last 50 years, although the former post office building on the left-hand side of screen is still there. George Street here is on my right, and the tram sort of passed on my right where the bike rider is now, and then travelled into the distance on the right and travelled down Broadway. The first lines we'll talk about were those serviced by the Ultimo tram depot, and this was a line up Harris Street to Pyrmont. Ultimo tram depot opened in December 1899, adjacent to the Ultimo power station. It was a depot for trams operating the services to Pyrmont and all the way out to Ryde. It was situated on the eastern side of Harris Street. Now today the building is still there, and it forms the private collection of the Powerhouse Museum. The Pyrmont line was a relatively short line that ended at the aptly named Terminus Hotel on the corner of Harris and John Street. Now the area is way more built up, and it's quite hard to tell that these pictures are exactly the same place. In the last decades of the system, the other line serviced by the Ultimo depot was the Drummoyne Ryde line. The line often started at Circular Quay, but at times started at Fort Macquarie and went via Pyrmont, Glebe Island Bridge, Rozelle, Drummoyne, over the Gladesville Bridge, rising up to Top Ryde. The terminus was at the western end of Blaxland Road, located near the current Top Ryde City Shopping Centre. The trip took just over an hour to complete and was the single longest route on the Sydney network. The tram service to Ryde was cut back beyond Gladesville and then later cut back beyond Drummoyne in 1949. And this cutback meant that trams no longer crossed the 1881 Gladesville Bridge. This bridge only carried one lane of traffic in each direction as well as the tramway. It featured a swing section on the southern end of the bridge that could be opened to permit sailing ships and steamers with high funnels to pass. It's hard to believe today that this was the main road to the northwest back then, especially as there is a large tree growing where the roadway used to be. The remainder of the other Inner West lines were generally serviced out of the Rozelle tram depot. Now, one of the shortest lines was the Glebe Point line, which went up Glebe Point Road. And it was also one of the earliest to open, with the first section being a steam tram in 1882, and it was also the first one to be electrified in April 1900. But before we talk about the Glebe end of the line, let's start at the city terminus. Although it did sometimes change, for most of life, the city terminus for the Glebe Point line was Millers Point. Now, the good thing about Millers Point is that many of the same buildings are there today, so it's easy to get your bearings looking at old photos. And clearly, the cutting for the loop line is still there, but now infilled with a community centre, a doctor's and a park. This line travelled under the Harbour Bridge and then went through the rocks, down George Street and turned north at Glebe Point Road, where it travelled basically in a straight line to the terminus. The line terminated outside what is today the Woolcock Medical Centre, although the bus stop for current Glebe buses continue further down the road today. Heading west, the next terminus was the Lilyfield line. Regular service started in 1909. The Lilyfield line branched off the Balmain line at Epping Junction. It then went via reserve track through Annandale, turned into Catherine Street and terminated at the intersection of Abattoir Road, which is now Lilyfield Road, and Grove Street. And this was on a bridge over the railway goods yard. This was the only tram terminus in Sydney that was located on a bridge. It's also now the current Lilyfield stop on the Inner West Light Rail, which is located underneath the bridge of the former terminus. The next group of lines were on the Balmain Peninsula, with services to Balmain and to Birchgrove. The first steam tram service to Darling Street was in 1892. 10 years later, the tracks were electrified. Services generally left the CBD via George Street and ran down Broadway. Now, the Circular Quay to Balmain services actually terminated at Gladstone Park, which is really in the main part of Balmain. Darling Street Wharf, which was right at the end of the point, was actually the terminus only for the cross-suburban route from Canterbury. Electric trams generally handled hills much better than steam trams, but some hills were just too much. One of these hills was the 400 metres of Darling Street in Balmain, which led down to the wharf. So they could run here, a counterweight trolley was installed under the road, connected by a cable to a dummy grip. Now, a tram going down the hill would push the dummy ahead of it, which raised the counterweight. Then on the return journey, the grip dummy would give the tram a helpful push back up the hill. The other line that serviced the Balmain Peninsula was the Birchgrove line. Tram services branched off from the main line on Darling Street, Balmain, turning into Roundtree Street, left into Cameron Street and then right into Grove Street before terminating at Wharf Road. Now today it's a pretty quiet part of the world, and I'm quite surprised that they ever wanted to build a tramway there in the first place. It may have been pretty quiet back then too, which may explain why it was one of the first lines of the Western lines to close in 1954. The most westerly line of the Western lines was the line to Abbotsford. The first section of this line was opened in 1890 and it was extended to Abbotsford Point in 1893. It serviced the suburbs of Leichhardt, Haberfield, Five Dock and terminated at Abbotsford. At the time of the line's opening, this area was quite gentrified and was often used by tourist trams and for people wanting to watch rowing events at the river at Abbotsford Point. Now, interestingly, there is still a short section of track visible at the terminus of the end of the line. In effect, this wasn't actually running track, it was an emergency diversion track to stop a runaway tram from rolling into the harbour. Now, this is the bit of the video that my friends have called the sad part. It's the bit where I talk about the closure of the lines. And this animation is not an accurate time-bound depiction of the lines closing, but it does look pretty dramatic. However, the system did close in stages from about 1950 through to the eventual closure of all remaining lines in 1958. Now, well, that about covers it. If I've missed anything or not got facts correct, please leave a comment. Thank you. I try and read all of them and reply if I've got anything of value to add. But most of all, thank you for watching another one of the videos. I hope you find them entertaining. For me, they're really great fun to make. And thank you all to the sources of information and images for these videos. See you next time on BackTracks.